Karen Swanson was in full HOA Karen mode as she stormed up to the grieving family, her face twisted with indignation. "This is a clear violation of our community guidelines," she shrieked, waving a crumpled stack of papers. "You did not submit the proper paperwork for this ridiculous display." The Livingston family stared at her, stunned into silence as they surrounded the casket of their beloved son. Their eyes were red and puffy from hours of weeping, but Karen seemed oblivious to their grief. "This is unacceptable," she continued, her voice raising an octave. "I demand that you cease this unauthorized gathering immediately and remove the casket from the premises." Gerald Livingston, the father, finally found his voice. "Mom, we are in the middle of a funeral for our son," he said, his tone laden with disbelief and sorrow. "This is not the time or place for your nonsense." Karen's lips thinned into a tight line. "Nonsense?" she sputtered. "Nonsense? This is a flagrant disregard for our community's rules and regulations. I will not stand for it." The other mourners, who had been quietly murmuring words of comfort to the Livingstons, now turned to stare at Karen, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. "Mrs. Swanson, please," said Allison, the Livingston's daughter. "Can't you see we're grieving? This is my brother's _funeral _. Have some compassion." Karen scoffed, her gaze sweeping over the gathered family and friends. "Compassion? I have no compassion for those who flaunt the rules. Rules are rules, and they must be followed, no matter the circumstances." Suddenly, a tall, well-dressed man stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with barely contained fury. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Swanson?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Karen's eyes widened as she recognized the man, Attorney General Livingston. She gasped, her confident demeanor faltering. I was just... "I believe my family is in the middle of a private ceremony," he said, his tone clipped. "One that does not require your interference or approval." Karen opened and closed her mouth several times, her face flushing with embarrassment. I was only trying to uphold the community guidelines," she stammered. "Well, your efforts are not welcome here," the Attorney General said, his gaze hardening. "I suggest you leave, Mrs. Swanson, before I am forced to take official action." Karen's eyes darted from the Attorney General to the Livingston family, who were all staring at her with a mix of disdain and pity. Realizing she had lost this battle, she turned on her heel and stomped away, muttering under her breath. As the Livingstons watched her retreating figure, a collective sigh of relief passed through the gathered mourners. The Attorney General placed a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder, and they both turned to face the casket, their expressions somber and reflective. The next day, Karen Swanson was fuming. She couldn't believe the gall of that Livingston family, blatantly disregarding the HOA's rules and regulations. And the fact that the Attorney General himself had stepped in to defend them only added insult to injury. As she paced around her immaculate living room, Karen's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan to get back at the Livingstons. She couldn't let them get away with this blatant show of disrespect for the community. Suddenly, an idea struck her. A sly grin spread across her face as she reached for her phone and began dialing. "Yes, hello, this is Karen Swanson from the Oakwood Estates HOA," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm calling to report a flagrant violation of our community guidelines." On the other end of the line, the HOA representative listened intently as Karen laid out her case. She emphasized the Livingstons' refusal to follow proper procedures, their disruptive funeral, and the Attorney General's interference. "This is simply unacceptable," Karen said, her tone becoming increasingly indignant. "Something must be done to ensure that our community standards are upheld, no matter who is involved." The HOA representative, sensing the gravity of the situation, assured Karen that the matter would be addressed immediately. "We take these sorts of violations very seriously, Mrs. Swanson," the representative said. "Rest assured, we will look into this and take the appropriate action." Karen's grin widened as she hung up the phone. "Well, you'll be hearing from us, Livingstons," she muttered, her eyes glinting with malice. "No one defies Karen Swanson and gets away with it." Over the next few days, The Livingstons were bombarded with a series of increasingly aggressive letters and notices from the HOA. First, they received a formal warning about the unauthorized gathering at the funeral, along with a demand for a hefty fine. When the Livingstons tried to appeal the decision, they were met with a barrage of bureaucratic red tape and stalling tactics. The HOA seemed determined to make their lives as difficult as possible. Frustrated and emotionally exhausted, the family reached out to the Attorney General for help. But even with his influence, they found themselves at a dead end, unable to make any headway against the relentless onslaught of the HOA. As the days turned into weeks, the Livingstons began to wonder if they would ever find peace. And all the while, Karen Swanson sat back, reveling in her victory, oblivious to the true depth of the pain and suffering she had caused. Fueled by her perceived triumph over the Livingston family, Karen's sense of power and entitlement only grew. She strutted around the neighborhood, her head held high, as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. One day, as she was out for her daily power walk, she spotted the Livingston family's dog, a friendly golden retriever named Buddy, playing in his own yard. A wicked grin spread across her face as she approached the fence. Well, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Looks like someone's been breaking the rules again. Buddy bounded over to the fence, his tail wagging enthusiastically. Karen scowled and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small notebook. According to the HOA guidelines, all pets must be kept on a leash at all times when outside the home, she said, her eyes narrowing. I'm afraid I'm going to have to issue a citation. Allison Livingston, who had been watching from the porch, hurried over to the fence. Mrs. Swanson, please, she pleaded. Buddy is a well-behaved dog. He's never caused any trouble, and he's always supervised when he's outside. Karen sniffed disdainfully. Rules are rules, young lady, she said, and I intend to enforce them, no matter who is involved. Allison's face fell, and she turned to call for her father. Dad, come quick. Mrs. Swanson is trying to fine us for Buddy being in the yard. The Attorney General emerged from the house, his expression grim. Mrs. Swanson, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I thought we had an understanding. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she squared her shoulders defiantly. I'm simply upholding the community guidelines, underscore Livingston, she said, emphasizing his title. Your family has shown a blatant disregard for the rules, and I won't stand for it any longer. The Attorney General's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer to the fence. I suggest you reconsider your actions, Mrs. Swanson, he said, his tone laced with warning. You don't want to find out what happens when you push this family too far. Karen's confident facade faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. I'm not afraid of you or your family, Attorney General, she spat. I'm going to make sure that every single one of your rule-breaking antics is punished to the fullest extent of the law. With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving the Livingstons staring after her, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. As Karen disappeared from sight, Allison turned to her father, her eyes brimming with tears. What are we going to do, Dad? She asked, her voice quivering. The Attorney General sighed heavily and placed a comforting arm around his daughter's shoulders. Don't worry, sweetheart, he said, his gaze fixed on the retreating figure of Karen Swanson. I'll handle this. One way or another, we're going to put an end to Mrs. Swanson's reign of terror. Over the next few days, the Livingston family found themselves embroiled in an ever-escalating battle with the HOA and Karen Swanson. Every time they thought they had found a way to resolve the situation, Karen would find a new way to antagonize them. First, it was a series of citations for minor infractions, like a chipped paint on the front door or a wayward weed in the garden. The fines started to add up, causing the family significant financial strain. Then, Karen began filing complaints about the Livingstons' Christmas decorations, their trash cans being left out too long, and even the height of their grass. The HOA responded by issuing more citations and threatening to take legal action. The Livingstons tried to reason with the HOA, pointing out the unfairness of the situation and the emotional toll it was taking on their family. But their pleas fell on deaf ears as Karen continued to manipulate the system to her advantage. "This is ridiculous," Gerald Livingston explained one evening as he and his wife pored over the latest stack of HOA correspondence. "We're being targeted and harassed, and there's nothing we can do about it." Allison, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Dad, maybe it's time to take this to the media," she suggested. "If we can get the community to see what's really going on, maybe they'll put pressure on the HOA to back off." The Attorney General considered the idea, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's a risky move," he said, "but at this point, we may not have much choice. Karen Swanson has gone too far, and the HOA seems intent on backing her up no matter what." Determined to take action, the Livingstons began reaching out to local news outlets, sharing their story and the evidence of the HOA's unfair treatment. At first, the reporters were skeptical, but as they delved deeper into the case, they were shocked by the extent of Karen's misconduct. Soon, the story began to gain traction, with headlines like "Grieving Family Terrorized by Power-Hungry HOA President" and "Attorney General Battles Neighborhood Karen in Bizarre Feud." As the media attention intensified, the HOA found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Calls poured in from concerned residents, many of whom had their own stories of Karen's heavy-handed tactics. The board members, who had previously been content to let Karen run roughshod over the community, now found themselves on the defensive. Karen, meanwhile, was livid. She couldn't believe that the Livingstons had the audacity to air their petty grievances in public. "This is an outrage," she fumed, pacing around her living room. "They're making a mockery of our community and everything I've worked so hard to uphold." Determined to regain control of the narrative, Karen began making frantic calls to the HOA board, demanding that they take immediate action to silence the Livingstons and their supporters. But this time, her pleas fell on increasingly skeptical ears. As the pressure mounted, the HOA found itself facing a difficult choice: continue to back Karen's crusade, or bow to the demands of the outraged community and put an end to the Livingston family's ordeal. With the media spotlight shining brightly on the Livingston family's plight, the HOA board found itself in a precarious position. They could no longer ignore the growing public outcry against Karen Swanson's tactics, and they knew that continuing to side with her would only further damage the community's reputation. After a heated and contentious meeting, the board members finally agreed that something had to be done. They summoned Karen to a private conference, determined to put an end to her relentless harassment of the Livingstons. "Mrs. Swanson," the HOA president began, his tone stern, "we've been reviewing the situation with the Livingston family, and we're deeply concerned by the action you've taken on behalf of the HOA." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the president raised a hand to silence her. "No, let me finish," he continued. "The fines, the citations, the constant pressure, it's gone too far. The community is outraged, and frankly, we're worried about the legal and financial implications of your behavior." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "But the Livingstons have shown a blatant disregard for our community guidelines," she argued, her voice rising. "They must be held accountable." The president shook his head. "That may be true, Mrs. Swanson, but your response has been entirely disproportionate. We simply cannot condone your actions, and we're here to tell you that it has to stop." Karen's jaw tightened, and she glared at the board members with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're siding with them," she hissed. "After everything I've done to uphold the integrity of this community." "We're not siding with anyone," the president said firmly. "We're simply acknowledging that your actions have gone too far, and that the best course of action is to put an end to this feud." Karen opened and closed her mouth several times, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a response. Finally, she fixed the board with a steely gaze. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "The Livingstons have shown a complete disregard for the rules, and they need to be held accountable. If you refuse to do it, then I'll take matters into my own hands." The president sighed heavily. "Mrs. Swanson, I'm warning you, if you continue to harass the Livingston family, we will have no choice but to remove you from your position on the HOA board. Do I make myself clear?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and she nodded stiffly. "Crystal," she muttered, before turning on her heel and stalking out of the room. As the door slammed behind her, the board members exchanged worried glances. They knew that they had taken a significant risk in standing up to Karen, but they also knew that they had no choice. The Livingston family's plight had become a matter of community-wide concern, and they couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. Karen Swanson was seething as she stormed out of the HOA meeting. How dare they undermine her authority and side with the Livingstons? Of all people, after all the hard work she had put into upholding the community's standards, this was the thanks she got. As she walked home, Karen's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan to regain control of the situation. She couldn't let the Livingstons get away with their disrespect for the rules, and she certainly couldn't allow the HOA board to take away her position of power. Suddenly, an idea struck her. A malicious grin spread across her face as she quickened her pace, determined to put her plan into action as soon as possible. That evening, Karen made a series of carefully orchestrated phone calls, reaching out to her network of like-minded neighbors who shared her passion for community integrity. She painted a picture of the Livingstons as ungrateful, rule-breaking troublemakers, and urged her allies to take action. This is our community, and we can't let a few rogue individuals tear it apart, she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. We need to show the HOA board that we won't stand for their capitulation to the Livingstons' demands. As word of Karen's call to arms spread through the neighborhood, a small but vocal group of residents began to rally behind her. They flooded the HOA with angry emails and phone calls, demanding that the board reconsider its decision to rein in Karen's crusade. The board members, caught off guard by the sudden surge of opposition, found themselves in a difficult position. They had hoped that by standing up to Karen, they would be able to diffuse the situation and restore a sense of calm to the community. But now they were faced with the prospect of a full-blown revolt. Sensing an opportunity, Karen seized the initiative. She organized a series of community meetings at her home, where she rallied her supporters and plotted their next moves. Their goal was simple: to overwhelm the HOA board with enough pressure and dissent to force them to reinstate Karen's authority. As the Livingstons watched the events unfold with growing concern, the Attorney General realized that he would need to take drastic action to protect his family. He reached out to his contacts in the state government, determined to find a way to put an end to Karen's crusade once and for all. This has gone far enough, he said, his brow furrowed with determination. It's time to bring in the big guns and shut this down for good. As the tension in the community continued to escalate, the Attorney General knew he had to act quickly to protect his family. He reached out to his contacts in the state government, determined to find a way to put an end to Karen Swanson's relentless crusade. After several heated discussions, the Attorney General devised a bold plan. He would use his political influence to launch a full-scale investigation into the Oakwood Estates HOA, scrutinizing its policies, procedures, and financial records. If there's any wrongdoing or abuse of power happening here, we're going to uncover it, the Attorney General said, his eyes narrowing with determination. And we're going to make sure that Karen Swanson and the rest of the HOA board are held accountable. The Livingston family watched with a mix of hope and trepidation as the investigation got underway. They knew that taking on the HOA and Karen Swanson would be a formidable challenge, but they also knew that they had no other choice. As the state investigators delved deeper into the HOA's operations, they uncovered a startling pattern of abuse and mismanagement. It became clear that Karen Swanson had been using her position of power to bully and harass residents, often in direct violation of the community's own bylaws. The investigators also discovered that the HOA board had been complicit in Karen's actions, turning a blind eye to her misconduct and even helping to cover it up. The board members were quickly subpoenaed, and they found themselves facing the prospect of criminal charges. When the news of the investigation broke, Karen Swanson was livid. She immediately called an emergency meeting of her supporters, determined to rally them to her cause once again. "This is an outrage," she shouted, her face flushed with anger. "The Livingstons have gone too far, and now they're dragging the entire community down with them. We can't let them win." But this time, Karen's rallying cry fell on deaf ears. Many of her former supporters had been shaken by the revelations of the investigation, and they were no longer willing to blindly follow her lead. "Maybe we were too quick to believe you, Karen," one of the neighbors said, his expression troubled. "This whole thing just doesn't feel right anymore." Frustrated and isolated, Karen realized that her power was beginning to slip away. She desperately tried to regain control of the situation, but the more she pushed, the more the community pushed back. As the investigation continued to uncover the extent of Karen's misconduct, the HOA board was forced to take drastic action. They had no choice but to remove Karen from her position and issue a public apology to the Livingston family. The Livingstons, relieved and vindicated, finally felt like they could begin to heal from the trauma they had endured. And as for Karen Swanson, she found herself facing the very consequences she had worked so hard to avoid. Equals in the aftermath of the HOA investigation, Karen Swanson found herself in a precarious position. She had been stripped of her position on the board and faced the very real possibility of criminal charges for her actions. Desperate to salvage her reputation and avoid the consequences of her behavior, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She began reaching out to the media, painting herself as the victim of a political witch hunt orchestrated by the Livingston family. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding," she told a local news reporter, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "I was only trying to uphold the community's standards and protect the integrity of our neighborhood. But the Livingstons and their powerful connections have turned the entire situation against me." However, the media was no longer willing to give Karen the benefit of the doubt. The investigation had uncovered too much evidence of her misconduct, and the public had already turned against her. As the news of Karen's attempt to spin the story spread through the community, the Livingstons and their supporters rallied in response. They organized a series of town hall meetings, where residents could come together to share their own experiences with Karen's heavy-handed tactics. The turnout was overwhelming, and the stories that emerged were nothing short of shocking. Neighbors recounted tales of Karen bullying and harassing them over the most trivial of infractions, and many even revealed that they had been coerced into supporting her crusade through threats and intimidation. The Attorney General, who had been closely monitoring the situation, seized the opportunity to make a public statement. The actions of Mrs. Swanson and the former HOA board members were not only unethical, but in many cases, they were also illegal. He declared, "We will be pursuing the full extent of the law to ensure that justice is served." As the legal proceedings against Karen and the HOA board members moved forward, the Livingston family finally found the peace and closure they had been seeking. They were able to grieve their loss without the constant threat of harassment, and they even received a formal apology from the community for the way they had been treated. For Karen, the consequences of her actions were swift and severe. She was charged with a litany of offenses, including abuse of power, harassment, and financial mismanagement. The once powerful HOA Karen found herself facing the very real possibility of jail time. As the dust settled, the Livingston family emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of resilience and community. They had fought against the tyranny of Karen Swanson and the corrupt HOA board, and in the end, they had emerged victorious. And for Karen, the once untouchable neighborhood tyrant, the lesson was a hard one, that even the most powerful can fall when they lose sight of the true meaning of community.